They told you wealth moves slowly. Then one morning, the floor vanished. In a single quarter, valuations imploded, interest rates snapped like piano wire, and the gulf between debtors and dollar holders became a canyon you could drop a city into. The first to fall were the overleveraged. Homes swapped for balance sheet entries, businesses traded for coupons, jobs exchanged for severance lines that dissolved in inflation's heat. But in the noise, a quiet algorithm clicked. Those with liquidity harvested volatility. Those with data bought fear. Those with patience leased time itself. Margin calls became invitations. Distressed assets, scavenger hunts, rescue capital, a velvet guillotine. The transfer didn't look like a robbery. It looked like paperwork. And while headlines argued about fairness, signatures wrote a new aristocracy. Blink, and you'll miss the handoff. Listen, and you'll hear the ink drying on the richest trade of a generation. It began as a liquidity drought masquerading as weather. A few dry prints, then parched credit, then assets cracking like riverbeds. Rates rose and balance sheets shrank, and suddenly, the map of who owned tomorrow was redrawn by whoever held cash today. In the gap between fear and price, a certain kind of capital appeared. Quiet, patient, and hungry. It floated lifelines that looked like anchors, wrapped covenants in velvet, and called urgency opportunity. Families sold time to pay for time. Founders traded control for runway. Cities pawned futures for present relief. The crisis didn't pick winners. The response did. Leverage is a promise with a timer, and the bell rang early. When collateral fell, contracts spoke louder than pleas. Warehouses of inventory turned from assets to obligations. Offices transformed into empty theaters of fluorescent ghosts. Yet in the rubble, auctions bloomed like night flowers. The logic was cruel but clear. Return beats romance. Those who memorized cash flow math stepped through smoke with calculators for compasses, marking down, marking up, marking time. To them, volatility wasn't chaos. It was yield with bad lighting. Data noticed first. Patterns curled at the edges before humans smelled smoke. When spreads widened by a hair, Mai's models screamed in the quiet language of deviation. She traced the panic in micro-jitters across order books, then pointed to a doorway nobody else saw. Basis trades, distressed paper, assets misheard by algorithms too scared to listen. Aisha nodded once and opened the war chest labeled dry powder. The plan wasn't to be brave. The plan was to be early and liquid. And then the phone calls. 10 minutes until a margin call, 2 hours to wire, 24 to decide the fate of a decade. Some begged for mercy. Others chose to sell memory for math. Elena stitched together parcels of value from maps. Nobody bothered to redraw. Omar wrote terms that felt like stairs and looked like cliffs. Daniel executed with hands that shook only after the confirmations arrived. Wealth didn't vanish. It changed addresses, forwarding mail to entities with patience, paperwork, and the stomach for midnight. The spread widened like a doorway to an unlit room, and inside waited instruments no one bragged about at dinner. Aisha mapped the staircase. Buy cash flows that panic had mispriced, finance them cheaply, hedge the tail like a superstition. Daniel built the lattice of orders, each a ladder rung over a pit. May tuned the model's ear to listen for the thin whistle of forced sellers. Elena stitched neighborhoods and notes into a patchwork balance sheet that could breathe. Omar translated urgency into clauses that turned risk into rent. Around them, the market coughed up assets as if expelling smoke. Mortgages, receivables, hollowed offices, each carrying a story priced in sorrow and basis points. The thesis was simple and cold. Volatility is a generosity the patient can bank. The execution was anything but simple. Clockwork hands inside a storm. Policy arrived with sirens muted. Facilities with long names and longer shadows. Liquidity Windows cracked open at midnight and shut at noon. The price of breathing changed by the hour. Aisha didn't argue with the weather. She measured it. When yields hiccuped, she fed the shake into hedges. When spreads yawned, she stepped across with measured boots. Daniel chased counterparties through the fog of compliance, swapping basis for certainty. I found the rhythm inside the noise, distressed prints pulsing like a metronome, while Elena flagged deeds whose owners whispered, "Soon Omar's covenants, threaded needles, latitude for them, parachutes for us." The trade was not heroism but choreography. A foxtrot between panic and policy where one misstep meant headlines, and the right step meant cash flows that outlived the storm. The first acquisition looked ordinary, numbers in a table, signatures in blue ink, but it moved like a tide. A parcel of half-leased warehouses with roofs that sighed in wind, cash flows uneven as a heartbeat. Elena walked the concrete, counting forklifts and pigeons. Daniel audited meters that spun too fast. Mai adjusted a curve that assumed more tenants than truth allowed. Omar laddered protections, reserves that filled when vacancy rose, waterfalls that punished laziness. Aisha called it the prototype. Buy the cash at a discount, buy the time to fix it, sell the story only when it becomes a fact. The closing wire landed with no drama, just the small hum of a server acknowledging new owners. Somewhere a lender slept, lighter by a problem and a promise. Somewhere else, the tide turned a degree in our favor. It wasn't only buildings. Paper too. Changed hands like postcards from a bad vacation. Pools of loans once celebrated in glossy decks, now traded in whispers. The math had not lied, only the assumptions had. My separated signal from superstition, tracing prepayment ghosts and delinquency shadows. Daniel floated bids that were insults dressed as offers until eventually they were accepted. Omar structured a sleeve that paid us to wait and punished us for greed. Aisha signed unblinking. In the ledger's quiet, coupons began to arrive. Small, steady, unexciting. That was the point. The greatest transfer rarely announces itself with fanfare. It ticks. Each coupon was a syllable in the new language of ownership, and together they formed a sentence. We will own what others could not hold. Success seduces with tidy graphs, but risk prefers costume changes. The portfolio swelled, and with it came hairline fractures, a counterparty rumored thin, a roof that wept in sideways rain, a tenant with a CFO who loved optimism more than arithmetic. Aisha insisted on drills. Assume failure, rehearse survival. Daniel built redundancy into the pipes. May mapped stress across scenarios meaner than history. Elena renegotiated leases inch by inch. Omar rehearsed the unpleasant conversations that keep tomorrow solvent. The aim was not to be invincible, but to be difficult to kill. In the quiet hours, as city lights blinked like cursors, the team understood the shape of the game. Compounding is not a curve. It is a fortress built from days you do not lose. Growth tested the hinges. With assets spread across zip codes and acronyms, the real fight shifted from price to plumbing. Cash had to move like capillaries. Data had to speak without accents. Aisha drew a map that looked like a subway of dollars. Rents feeding reserves. Reserves feeding capex. Capex breeding stability. Daniel tuned the settlement rails until funds landed with the punctuality of sunrise. Mai taught the portfolio to breathe. Sensors whispering when humidity rose or delinquency twitched. Elena walked leases into living things. Escalators, extension options, co-tenancy clauses, while Omar translated ambition into covenants that forgave mistakes but never lies. The crisis fed the pipeline. Discipline kept it from choking us. In the calm between closings, they counted not trophies, but failures avoided. A loan never tripped. A vendor paid before resentment accrued. A rumor diffused with a spreadsheet. Wealth transfer is glamorous in headlines. In rooms like these, it's valves and rhythms. The headlines pivoted from panic to politics. Who benefits? Arrived in bold fonts, and behind the question lingered faces, neighborhoods, nights spent counting last bills. Aisha refused the villain's hat but accepted the microphone. She talked in the language of cash flows and roofs that didn't leak, of payrolls rescued by rent certainty, of vendors who slept because invoices cleared. Elena curated repairs that mattered. Lights in a loading dock that a night shift called daylight, a daycare tenant who needed a month, not a miracle. My measured social risk like basis risk, assigning numbers to tempers and promises. Omar drafted side letters that traded patience for maintenance and set penalties for neglect. Daniel published the portfolio's bones, energy use trending down, occupancy inching up, complaints answered inside an hour. The wealth transfer was real. The question was whether it could also be a repair, profit earned by fixing what fear abandoned. Then the market tested faith. Rates jolted again. Small on paper, violent in plumbing. Debt service crept like water under a door. Aisha called the drill live. Triage liquidity, refactor maturities, replace fragility with time. Daniel lined counterparties like dominoes and tipped them in sequence. Amend, extend, sweeten, secure. My scenarios turned mean. Her screens painted futures where tenants faltered and cap rates yawned. Elena went door to door with numbers and respect, trading concessions for term. Fix for fix. Omar turned covenants into choreography, moving triggers just enough to keep the music playing. When a warehouse roof sighed under an unexpected squall, CapEx sprinted and sensors tattled in time. The leak became a day, not a disaster. The lesson wasn't new, but it was earned again. Resilience is purchased in dull hours so that excitement cannot bankrupt you later. The transfer continued, not by luck, by stamina. Opportunity wore a new costume, technology that turned square footage into signal. Mai proposed a retrofit. Smart meters, occupancy heat maps, predictive maintenance, less glamour than gravity. The budget argued. The math won. Aisha framed it as buying yield cheaply. Daniel negotiated bulk installs at prices that looked like typos. Elena signed tenants onto dashboards that made their costs legible and their complaints actionable. The first month's savings looked modest, the third conspicuous, the sixth undeniable. Vacancies shrank as reliability rose. Insurers noticed. Lenders smiled with lower spreads. Omar inked green clauses that paid back faster than the ink dried. The transfer tightened, not by acquiring more, but by extracting intelligence from what already sat on the ledger. It felt like cheating until they remembered it was simply attention. Compound interest applied to knowledge. With stability came a question that splits teams: hold or harvest. The bid arrived, clean, flattering, rational. Selling would validate the thesis. Holding would test belief in the engine they had built. They gathered without romance, only numbers, and the kind of silence that respects consequences. Mai showed curves that bent upward, if patience outlived policy. Daniel revealed the pipes ready for larger flow. Elena argued for the tenants who had staked futures on continuity. Omar laid out clauses that protected either path. Aisha listened like a banker and a builder and decided like both. Sell a slice to prove the market right. Keep the spine to prove themselves righter. The transfer would not be a headline exit but a patient climb. Cash returned to investors while the asset learned to speak fluently. In that compromise lived their edge. Conviction tempered by cash. Success bred mirrors. Competitors arrived with borrowed swagger and discount capital, promising tenants the same reliability for fewer commas. Spreads tightened, brokers spoke in riddles, and headlines recast discipline as luck. Aisha refused the arms race. She sharpened the moat. Service-level guarantees turned from courtesies into contracts. Uptime became a pledge, not a hope. Mai split the portfolio like a prism, finding where one extra technician or a smarter route could carve hours into minutes. Daniel rewired vendor terms to trade price for priority. When storms hit, Elena curated a waiting list born from trust rather than incentives, while Omar locked in covenants that valued continuity over bravado. The game shifted from buying cheap to keeping well, from extracting yield to earning it in public. When an impatient fund undercut a rent, Aishi let it, then leased the space back 6 months later from a vacancy they hadn't forecast. The transfer favored patience dressed as craft. Scrutiny followed like weather. A hearing summoned lenders, landlords, activists, and the arithmetic in between. Were they stabilizers or opportunists, healers or harvesters? Aisha answered in verbs. Repaired, paid, extended, hired. Daniel unpacked latency and maintenance tickets until it became human. Mai translated basis points into school pickups and night shifts. Elena testified to roofs that no longer leaked and docks that no longer failed at dawn. Omar spoke of covenants that penalized neglect as fiercely as default, equity that absorbed first loss, not last. The room wanted villains or saints. The work offered plumbers. In the pause after cross-examination, numbers did what numbers do. They drew a line from crisis to continuity. The transfer, Aisha argued, was not a theft but a reassignment from chaos to custody, priced in risk and delivered in repairs. The panel didn't clap. They filed. That was enough. Policy prefers documentation to applause. Borders tempted the thesis to grow a second passport. Distress spoke new languages, currency swings, mismatched standards, politics in the plumbing. Aisha treated geography like duration. Seductive if hedged, lethal if romanticized. Mai built a dashboard where FX danced with vacancy, where legal quirks sat beside weather patterns. Daniel negotiated custody and cash movement that wouldn't stall at customs. Elena flew light, learning what good bones meant in brick older than their balance sheet. Omar hired local counsel who translated custom into covenant without losing teeth. The first overseas deal was small by design, a pilot with training wheels and an exit lane. The yield looked ordinary until adjusted for chaos avoided. Then it gleamed. The transfer widened quietly, not as empire but as echo. The same craft, tuned to a new dialect, returning coupons in a currency they'd already hedged. Ambition measured itself in survivable increments. Scale pressure exposed the seam between speed and sense. A vendor cut corners on a retrofit. A whistle carried through a vent before the smoke did. Aisha halted the rollout mid-sentence, choosing embarrassment over risk. Mai traced anomalies to a batch code. Daniel froze payments and rerouted crews. Elena returned to tenants with honesty and timelines. Omar drafted amendments that converted apology into liquidated damages. Reputation, they learned again, is a balance sheet asset with zero amortization. Guard it, or go bankrupt in whispers. By week's end, sensors reported not only data but trust restored, response times compressed beyond their own targets. The cost showed up in the quarter. The value would live in the years. Wealth transfer is fragile cargo. The hands that carry it must be clean. They put their signature under that lesson twice. Then the macro story turned a page without warning. A policy speech moved 2 sentences and the curve lurched. Credit windows narrowed. Spreads remembered how to yawn. The market asked whether the easy part had ended, and whether they'd mistaken a tailwind for genius. Aisha gathered the team and put humility on the table next to coffee. They reviewed every loan, every hinge, every rumor. Daniel primed refinancing paths like escape hatches. Mai fattened reserves by shaving optionality elsewhere. Elena approached tenants early, swapping modest concessions for longer lines. Omar renegotiated floors and caps before. The stampede formed. The portfolio braced, not to hide but to bend. If this was the end of cheap time, they would buy expensive certainty. The greatest transfer in history wasn't over. It was entering its adult phase, where craft outruns luck and discipline compounds like interest on character. Maturity walls appeared on the horizon like cliffs sketched in pencil, faint until the fog burned off. Cheap time had expired. Expensive certainty queued at the window. Aisha redrew priorities with the pragmatism of a surgeon. Amputate vanity, save circulation. Daniel built a refinancing ladder that stepped over chasms in even strides, swapping floating doubt for fixed sleep. I treated duration like weather, plotting storms across quarters, so reserves rose before the barometer fell. Elena worked the phones with the patience of a midwife. Mid-term renewals delivered ahead of need. Small rent upticks traded for longer leashes. Omar bargained with lenders whose courage came in spreads and covenants. He gave them comfort without setting control. The thesis aged from hunt to husbandry. Not how much you bought in the panic, but how elegantly you rolled the debt after applause died. The transfer's next chapter would be written in coupon math and calendar squares. Scale demanded an operating system, not a hero. Aisha codified instinct into rules. No orphan assets, no single points of failure, no returns without repairs. Daniel turned workflows into rails, tickets triaged by consequence, vendors ranked by uptime, cash sweeps that ran themselves at dusk. I wired the portfolio to whisper. Anomalies flagged before they could posture as surprises. She stripped superstition from dashboards until only signal remained. Elena moved tenant relations from charisma to cadence, visits paced like dividends, promises logged like liabilities. Omar hardened culture into contracts, incentives paying for prudence and clawbacks, punishing shortcuts. The crisis had taught them to buy. This chapter taught them to run without grinding teeth. Headlines no longer loved them, which was fine. The line items did. The wealth transfer proved itself not in new trophies, but in days that ended uneventfully. Pipes humming, roofs quiet, cash arriving like a familiar song. A rumor tested the seams. An anchor tenant's parent missed guidance and social feeds turned siren. Aisha banned panic and invited facts. I pulled card-by-card exposure, modeling default as a path rather than a cliff. The shock, she showed, would bruise cash, but not break bone. Daniel pre-negotiated backfills with brokers whose shoes knew the corridor. Elena walked the floor with managers at midnight, turning uncertainty into choreography. Temporary concessions for co-marketing. Pop-ups that filled silence with revenue. Omar prepared a pre-pack playbook that no one wanted but everyone respected. When the announcement finally landed, it was ugly but survivable. The store went dark on a Friday and reopened by Monday under a new banner. Rent unchanged, term shortened but stronger. Confidence returned not with slogans but with lights turning on. The transfer's endurance wasn't bravado. It was muscle memory. Capital knocked from a new direction. Pensions and endowments wanted in, not for headlines but for halos, yield tied to usefulness. Aisha welcomed the accountability and the scale, provided the math stayed boss. I designed impact metrics that couldn't be gamed. Energy saved, net of weather. Wages paid, net of turnover. Complaints resolved inside the hour. Daniel built a reporting cadence that made regulators nod and trustees exhale. Elena prioritized capex that tenants could photograph, lulled bays that made nights safer, vents that made days quieter. Omar wrote side letters where returns shared sunlight with obligations. Missed the targets and fees bled back. The race closed without fanfare, a quiet vote that the transfer could be stewarded, not merely captured. In the ledger, the new capital read like long rain. Steady, patient, indifferent to noise, insistent on roots. Craft had attracted conscience without surrendering discipline. At last, the first harvest worth naming. Not an exit, a trimming. Aisha sold a 22% slice of the earliest portfolio at a price that converted doubt into precedent. The wire didn't feel like victory. It felt like confirmation that the engine worked beyond weather. Distributions moved from promise to practice. Investors received cash with footnotes that read like lessons learned. Staff received bonuses that smelled like retention. Vendors received terms that ensured they'd answer calls on bad days. I archived the playbook with timestamps. Daniel compared modeled error to lived mess and smiled at the spread. Elena scheduled a modest ribbon cutting for the rehab doc. Nobody had celebrated. Omar closed the loop with lenders, who appreciated borrowers that read covenants for sport. The wealth transfer continued, slow and disciplined, like a river redirected by patient hands. The crisis had been the spark. Stewardship turned it into light. The hit arrived at 9:12 a.m. An activist report dressed like scripture, accusing the portfolio of papered-over vacancies, predatory covenants, and capex alchemy. Screens bled. Phones auditioned as alarms. Aisha didn't flinch. She inverted the theater. "Open the books," she said, and the war room turned museum. I stitched a living data room from raw feeds, Lee's ledgers, sensor logs, energy curves. Time-stamped and boring in the best way. Daniel mapped every accusation to a receipt, every insinuation to a maintenance ticket with grease under its fingernails. Elena gathered tenant voices not as PR but deposition-grade truth. Omar drafted a response that read less like defense and more like anatomy. By noon, the market still twitched, but doubt had somewhere to go and collide with facts. The wealth transfer survives because custody out-argues narrative. Ownership that can be audited can be trusted. When the rebuttal posted, the curve softened like a held breath. At 2:03 p.m., wires stuttered. A custodian's rumor froze daylight credit, and the intricate ballet of cash tripped over its own feet. Payrolls waited like hostages. Lenders refreshed inboxes with the appetite of wolves. Aisha split the crisis into minutes. Secure floats pledged the cleanest collateral. Buy time even if it bills a premium. Daniel pulled the emergency rails. Sweeps to secondary banks. Intraday repo against treasuries they kept for superstitions like this. My ref forecast liquidity in 60-second increments, a heartbeat monitor for solvency. Elena called vendors to trade transparency for patience, measured in hours. Omar negotiated a daylight overdraft that felt like a bridge thrown across a canyon while they drove. By market close, the rumor found its ceiling and wires resumed their hum. Nothing broke because they'd rehearsed the break. The transfer advanced not with swagger but with plumbing that refused to panic. Reliability, priced right, is alpha. Across the ocean, politics redrew math. An overnight decree capped rent escalations and taxed vacancies as if malice caused weather. The small acquisition that had taught them humility now demanded fluency. Aisha banned outrage. She commissioned options. May rebuilt the model with cuffs around growth, extracting yield from efficiency rather than price. Daniel priced submetering and service bundles that turned reliability into revenue. Elena convened tenants into a consortium. Maintenance credits for timely access, co-marketing for shared footfall. Omar filed an injunction that didn't bet on victory so much as on time. What the law took from one column, craft recovered from another. Energy spend dropped, downtime fell. Churn softened, the decree remained, the cash resumed. In a world that confuses policy with physics, the transfer persists by changing the engine without stopping the car. Survival became a syllabus. Patience, the diploma. Opportunity knocked as a rival gasped. A platform that had sprinted through the panic now limped. Good people trapped inside bad processes. Assets that wanted adoption, not abandonment. The offer landed. Buy the whole, keep what works, excise the rest. Aisha feared indigestion more than envy. She sent the team with scalpels. Daniel dissected the rails and found latency disguised as culture. Migrated assets by data hygiene and fixable physics. Elena walked roofs and corridors, separating tired from terminal. Omar structured a purchase that paid for performance, not promises. The closing was brutal and clean. Crews kept, egos shed. Leases renegotiated in daylight. The trophy wasn't size but coherence. An engine that could digest another's mistakes without importing their destiny. The transfer widened not by conquest but by rescue with conditions. In the balance sheet's footnotes, it read as goodwill. In practice, it was discipline with a quiet smile. Night gathered, and with it, a rare quiet. They stood inside the hum of servers and distant traffic, the portfolio pulsing like a city they now knew by heart. The crisis that birthed the transfer felt both recent and fossilized. What remained was practice. Aisha reviewed the map. Cache paths, risk gates, human names beside asset codes. Daniel closed loops that no one would see but everyone would feel. May archive this month's scares as features for the next model. Elena scheduled tomorrow's small courtesies that keep tenants loyal. Omar drafted a letter to investors that didn't boast, it explained. The arc bent toward Act 7. Harvest without haste. Legacy without theater. If there was a secret, it fit on a single line: earn the right to hold. Wealth had moved not by trick but by stewardship under pressure, signatures that meant repairs, returns that sounded like roofs, not leaking. The camera exhaled. Morning waited. The endgame began with a spreadsheet that felt like a biography. Lines of cash told the story of roofs mended, leases extended, nights survived. Aisha circled 3 columns: duration, dispersion, demand, and underlined one word: crystallize. Not an exit, a translation. The portfolio would split like light through glass. A core kept for compounding, a ring monetized through a clean sale, and a stream securitized so coupons could speak for themselves. Daniel mapped counterparty appetite and found it healthy. May pressure-tested scenarios, meaner than memory. Elena confirmed tenants whose signatures would outlive guidance. Omar wrote documents that made good behavior automatic. Investors didn't cheer, they nodded, which mattered more. The crisis had minted an engine. Now it would prove resale value without trading its soul. When the first soft sound of done came from the wire, it wasn't triumph. It was a relay baton changing hands while the race continued at the same measured pace. Pricing day wore its superstition lightly. Bankers rehearsed narratives about resilience while Aisha trimmed adjectives until only numbers remained. The securitizations spoke in tranches, each risk carved to fit a particular stomach. The sale package read like a field manual. Photos of repaired docks beside energy, curves sloping down. Daniel watched books swing from cautious to covered. May flagged a last-minute model tweak that stiffened cushions without costing spread. Elena called tenants to confirm service windows during the transition, so no one noticed ownership changing, and Omar swapped a clause that converted fees into penalties if standards slipped. When the screen flashed green, it wasn't confetti, just basis points that respected craft. Cash returned to backers with footnotes about headwinds faced and avoided. A core spine stayed under their hand, quietly compounding. The transfer that began as rescue matured into circulation, capital leaving better marked than it arrived. If wealth merely moved, little changed. If capability moved with it, the map bent. Aisha proposed something unfashionable. Share the engine. A slice of the operating company became an employee trust. Bonuses indexed to uptime and tenant satisfaction, not rumors or headlines. Daniel opened the playbook to supervisors who'd once only received orders. Mai taught dashboards until maintenance techs argued like analysts and won. Elena gave brokers and managers a cadence, not a script. Omar rewrote employment letters so promises could be audited. The first quarter under the new plan felt different in quiet ways. Fewer escalations, faster fixes, emails that traveled with patience and ended in resolution. Investors asked if the margin would suffer. The numbers answered by widening, gently. As churn fell, and reputation became a referral. The transfer advanced again, not just capital crossing a ledger, but skill crossing a threshold, leaving the door unlatched behind it. They revisited the first asset like returning to a childhood street. The loading dock that once sighed in wind now exhaled efficiency. Tenants waved with the familiarity of monthly checks that always cleared. Aisha traced the arc. Crisis as spark, operations as oxygen, discipline as flame control. Daniel admitted the mistakes that taught them redundancies. Mai pointed to sensors that had grown predictive enough to feel like intuition. Elena tallied jobs that existed because someone picked up a wrench at midnight. Omar laughed softly about the clauses that saved them from their own optimism. The headline, "Greatest Wealth Transfer," felt smaller up close and more honest. Families with payrolls, vendors with steady calendars, investors with notes that behaved. The team stood without speeches, letting the scene narrate itself. If legacy existed, it was this. Value made visible, not merely value. Morning returned like a dividend. Expected, earned, unglamorous. The crisis had not been destiny. It had been weather. What persisted was the craft that turned fear into schedules, volatility into coupons, headlines into habits. Aisha sent the investor letter with gratitude and no adjectives. Daniel archived a systems map that newcomers could run by reading. May pushed a final model update titled Boredom Target, Variance Limited by Engineering. Elena posted a calendar of routine visits that made loyalty inevitable. Omar closed the file with a clause that rewarded future restraint over past swagger. Somewhere, wealth crossed another border in silence, chasing certainty, dressed as service. The camera lifted to a city that did not know it had been stabilized, and did not need to. The greatest transfer in history had looked like robbery to the untrained eye. From here, it looked like maintenance, of assets, of trust, of tomorrow. Cut.